The Mystery of the Locked Room. Good evening, my friend. Come and settle in. There is a chair here that has been waiting for you all day, and a fire that has just now caught properly, throwing its warm orange light across the room, the way it always does at this hour, when the world outside has gone dark and quiet, and there is nowhere left to be but exactly here. You need not do anything at all tonight. Not think, not solve, not puzzle anything through. That is my work this evening, and Mr. Sherlock Holmes's, as it always was. Yours is only to listen, and to let your body grow heavy and warm, and to let your mind wander gently along behind mine as I lead it, until, sometime before this story ends, I expect you will have wandered off to sleep entirely, and that will please me very much, for that has always been the whole purpose of these evenings we spend together. Tonight, I want to tell you of a puzzle that troubled even Sherlock Holmes for longer than most. A puzzle so neat, so tightly sealed, that for the better part of 2 days he would not say a single word about it that was not a question. A room locked from the inside. A treasure vanished from within it, and an old woman found asleep in her own armchair, quite unharmed, quite unable to say how such a thing could possibly have happened around her while she slept. Let your eyes close now, if they have not already begun to. I will speak slowly and low, the way I always do, and I promise you this. By the time this story reaches its quiet end, every locked door in it will have opened, gently, one at a time, and so, I expect, will yours. There is no need to follow every thread the moment I lay it down. Mysteries, told properly, are meant to be drifted through, rather than gripped tightly. A detail here, a suspicion there, a room examined slowly by lamplight, while the rest of the world goes soft and distant around it. If your attention wanders, if your eyes grow too heavy to keep pace with the story, that is not a failure of the telling. That is, in fact, precisely what I am hoping for. Rest now. Let me begin. It was a cold, bright February morning, the kind that comes after a long stretch of grey and startles London awake with a sky the colour of pale glass, when the telegram arrived at Baker Street that would carry Holmes and me down into the folded green hills of Hampshire, to a house called Thistlewood Grange, and to a mystery that I still, all these years later, consider one of the most perfectly constructed puzzles I ever saw my friend unravel. I remember Holmes reading the telegram twice through before he passed it to me, and I remember the particular light that had come into his eye as he did so. Not the sharp hunting light he wore when a case promised danger, but something quieter, more purely delighted, the expression of a man who has just been handed a very fine puzzle box and cannot wait to begin turning it over in his hands. The telegram read, "Come at once. Stop great misfortune. Stop the Wexford Star stolen from locked room. Stop room sealed windows barred. No entry possible. Stop, my aunt unharmed but distressed. Stop. Please come, Mr. Holmes, I beg you, stop. Constance Wexford." A locked room, Watson, Holmes said, already reaching for his coat, and a treasure gone missing from inside it. I confess I have not had a case built upon so classical a foundation in some years, and I find myself rather looking forward to it. Pack for 2 nights, and bring your revolver, though I suspect, from the tone of that telegram, we are more likely to need patience than firearms. We caught the 10:15 from Waterloo, and I remember that carriage well. The window fogged at its edges with our own breath, the flat brown fields of the home counties sliding slowly past, giving way by degrees to the softer, greener folds of Hampshire, where the frost still clung on that February morning to every north-facing hedge and ditch, like a fine grey powder that the sun had not yet found the strength to burn away. "Tell me what you know of the house," I said as we rode. "Very little, and I intend to keep it that way until we arrive," said Holmes. "I find that a case examined first through the evidence of one's own eyes, before ever it is coloured by another's account, yields a truer picture than one built up second-hand. I know only this. Thistlewood Grange belongs to a Mrs. Iris Wexford, widow of the late Sir Aubrey Wexford, and that the family has for 4 generations been custodian of a sapphire known as the Wexford Star, a stone of some considerable size and considerable legend, said to have been brought back from India by the first Sir Aubrey in the previous century, and said also, according to the family's own fond superstition, to bring misfortune upon any who remove it dishonestly from its rightful keeping. He glanced at me with the faint, dry amusement he reserved for such tales. Whether or not the stone carries a curse, Watson, I think we may say with confidence that it has already begun to carry a very great deal of trouble. You do not believe in the curse, I take it. I believe in it precisely as much as I believe in any story that has survived 4 generations, largely because it is a pleasant one to tell over the port after dinner, said Holmes. Which is to say, Watson, I believe a family finds it a great deal more comfortable to explain its own occasional misfortunes by pointing to an old stone than by examining its own choices too closely. Curses are, in my experience, rather more often a convenient shape given to very ordinary human folly after the fact. He fell silent a moment, watching the hedgerows pass. Though I grant you, a room locked from every side, with a treasure vanished clean out of the middle of it, is the sort of circumstance that makes even a rational man's thoughts wander, for a moment or two, toward less rational explanations. That, I suspect, is precisely why our young correspondent's telegram had such an edge of genuine fright to it, beneath all its urgency. I asked him, as the train wound on through villages whose names I no longer recall, what manner of family we might expect to find at the end of our journey, for Holmes, in those days, made something of a habit of forming a provisional picture of a household from the smallest of clues before ever setting eyes upon it, a habit I had learned, across a great many cases, not to dismiss merely because I could not always follow the reasoning that produced it. The telegram tells us a good deal if we trouble to read it properly, he said. It was sent by the niece, not the aunt, which suggests either that Mrs. Wexford was too shaken to compose it herself, or that the niece is, in general, the one who manages such practical business in that household, and I incline toward the latter, given the crisp, unhysterical wording, chosen even in evident distress. It was sent from the village post office, rather than by a servant dispatched to London, which tells us the household either mistrusts its own staff at this delicate moment, or simply moves at the brisker pace of a family accustomed to managing its own affairs, rather than delegating them. And it mentions the stone's name, the Wexford Star, with the easy, unself-conscious familiarity of a phrase used every day at that family's own table, which tells me it is no mere ornament to them, Watson, but something closer to an article of faith. He closed his eyes briefly, as though listening to some private echo of the telegram's own words. I expect we shall find a household that loves that stone rather more than its market value alone could account for, and a mystery, therefore, that will wound rather more deeply than an ordinary theft. Little more passed between us until the small Hampshire station came into view, its platform nearly deserted but for a porter and a boy with a barrow of milk churns, and we stepped down into air that was noticeably colder and cleaner than the London we had left behind that morning. Air that carried, even at the station itself, the faint green smell of wet earth and distant wood smoke that I have always associated, ever since, with the particular hush of an English country winter. We hired a trap from a stableman, who, upon hearing our destination, gave Holmes a long, curious look, before saying only, "Bad business up at the Grange, I hear, sir," and offering nothing further, despite Holmes's mild attempts to draw him out. The closed, careful reticence, I thought, of a village that had already begun turning the family's misfortune over privately among itself, unwilling yet to share its speculations with strangers. The lane that carried us on toward Thistlewood Grange wound between hedgerows still rimed with frost in the shadowed places, past fields lying fallow and dark beneath the thin winter sun, until at last the house itself rose into view above its own bare orchards, grey-gabled roofline first, Then the tall, twisted chimneys, then the whole soft, red brick bulk of it, settled into its hollow of land like something that had grown there rather than been built, and had simply been waiting, patiently, for whatever trouble was destined eventually to find it. Thistlewood Grange, when at last it rose fully into view at the end of its long avenue of bare limes, proved to be a handsome old house of soft red brick, Elizabethan in its bones, though much added to and altered over the centuries that followed, with tall twisted chimneys and mullioned windows that caught the low February sun in bright, fractured pieces. Rooks wheeled above its higher gables as we approached, calling to one another in the thin, cold air, and somewhere beyond the house's western wing I could hear the faint, unhurried barking of a dog, the ordinary small sounds of a country household going about its business, entirely unaware of how thoroughly that business had already been disturbed. A young woman was waiting for us upon the front steps, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the cold, and I saw at once, in the tightness about her eyes and the way her hands twisted together before her, the unmistakable signs of a night spent almost entirely without sleep. "Mr. Holmes," she came down the steps to meet us before we had even properly alighted. "I am Constance Wexford, my aunt's niece by marriage, though she has always called me simply her niece, and I her daughter, near enough. Thank you for coming so quickly. I hardly dared hope you would." "Your telegram was persuasive," said Holmes, taking her offered hand. "Tell me, how does your aunt fare this morning?" "Shaken. Bewildered. She does not remember a single thing of the night, Mr. Holmes. Not from the moment she settled into her chair after supper to the moment she woke this morning, still sitting in it, with the study door locked exactly as she had left it, and the star gone from its case as though it had simply dissolved into the air." Constance led us up the steps and into a wide, dark-panelled hall, warmed by a fire at its far end and hung with the portraits of several centuries of Wexfords, stern and watchful in their gilt frames. I confess I hardly slept myself, wondering how such a thing could possibly be. It is not merely that the door was locked, Mr. Holmes. It was bolted from the inside, with a bolt my aunt herself drew across before ever she sat down for the evening. The windows are barred since my great-grandfather's time, when there was some trouble with poachers, and never since altered. There is no other door, no chimney large enough for a child to pass through, let alone a grown thief. And yet the star is gone, and my aunt sat alone in that room the entire night, and swears upon her life that she neither saw nor heard a single thing amiss. "A very promising beginning," Holmes murmured, and I saw Constance Wexford glance at him with a flicker of something between offence and startled amusement, evidently unsure whether to be reassured or alarmed by a detective who greeted her family's calamity with such open relish. "Forgive me, Miss Wexford. I do not mean that your aunt's distress is a matter for amusement, only that a genuinely impossible circumstance is a rarer and more welcome thing in my profession than you might imagine, and I confess I have rather missed the sensation of encountering one. Let us go in, and let me see this room for myself, before another word of theory passes between us." The household, as we were shown through to the drawing-room to meet its assembled members, before proceeding to the scene of the crime, proved to be a modest one for so grand a house, a further sign, Holmes murmured to me under his breath, of an estate not quite so flush as its handsome exterior might suggest. Mrs. Iris Wexford herself sat near the fire, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown despite the hour, a small woman gone frail with age, her white hair still neatly dressed despite the evident trial of her night, her pale blue eyes holding a bewildered, exhausted quality that struck me at once as entirely genuine, the look of a woman who has woken to find the solid ground of her own understanding of the world unaccountably gone soft beneath her feet. "Mr. Holmes," her voice, when she spoke, was thin but steady. "I am glad you have come, though I confess I do not know what use even you can be against a thing that seems to have happened by no natural means at all. I do not deal in unnatural means, Mrs. Wexford, said Holmes gently, taking the chair Constance offered him near the old woman's own. Only in natural ones that have not yet been properly examined. I promise you, before I leave this house, either I shall have found the hand that took your sapphire, or I shall have found excellent reason to doubt that any hand took it at all. And I do not think, from what I have heard so far, that the second outcome is the likelier of the two. You are kinder than I deserve, coming all this way for an old woman's misfortune, Mrs. Wexford said, and I saw her thin hands, folded upon the arm of her chair, tremble very slightly with an exhaustion that went beyond mere lack of sleep. I took my chocolate, as I always do, a little after 9. I sat in my chair by the fire, as I always do, to read a little before bed. I remember beginning a chapter of a novel I had been enjoying, and I remember thinking how pleasantly warm the room had become. And then, Mr. Holmes, I remember nothing at all, nothing whatsoever, until I woke this morning still in that same chair, with a stiffness in my neck and a taste in my mouth I did not care for, and the case standing open and empty not 4 feet from where I sat the whole night through. You felt no illness beforehand? No unusual drowsiness beyond the ordinary tiredness of a winter evening? None that I marked at the time, she said, though I confess, thinking on it since, that ordinary tiredness does not generally hold a person quite so many hours past their usual waking, nor leave so unpleasant a taste behind it. I begin to wonder, Mr. Holmes, whether I was not perhaps unwell in some way I failed to notice. We shall return to that question presently, and I think you may find the answer rather less alarming in the end than it now appears, said Holmes, with a glance toward me that I understood, even then, to mean he had already begun forming a theory he did not yet wish to voice aloud. Tell me first, who in this household knew that you would be sitting in that room alone last night, with the door bolted as usual? Why, everyone, I should think, said Mrs. Wexford, with the faint, weary surprise of a woman who has never before had cause to consider her own habits a matter of any importance to anyone. I have sat in that room every evening for the better part of 40 years, Mr. Holmes. It is hardly a secret in this house. Beside Mrs. Wexford's chair stood a stout, balding man of perhaps 40, dressed with a careful, slightly threadbare neatness that put me in mind of a man clinging to appearances he could no longer entirely afford. His collar, just a shade too worn at the edge, his boots polished to a shine that could not quite disguise how long they had been resoled, and it was Constance who introduced him, with a faint but noticeable coolness in her voice, as my cousin Bertram, my aunt's nephew, and heir to Thistlewood. God willing, that day is a long way off yet. Mr. Holmes! Bertram Wexford's handshake was damp, and his eyes, I noticed, would not quite hold Holmes's own for more than a moment at a time. A dreadful business. Dreadful. I've told Aunt Iris 100 times that Stone ought to have been in a bank vault in London years ago, not sitting about in a country house study for any passing rogue to make off with. And yet, it did not, apparently, sit about for any passing rogue, Holmes observed mildly, given that no rogue appears to have passed anywhere near it, the room being, as I understand, quite sealed. Bertram's smile flickered. Quite so, a puzzle indeed. The last person in the room was introduced as Mr. Josiah Renwick, a thin, silver-haired gentleman of perhaps 65, dressed with a jeweller's careful, old-fashioned elegance, a small case of instruments visible at his side even now, hours after the crisis that had presumably interrupted whatever errand had originally brought him to Thistlewood. Mr. Renwick has been a friend of this family for 35 years, Mrs. Wexford explained. My husband trusted him above any other man in his profession. He was to have examined the star this very week, in fact, for a new insurance valuation, before it travels up to London next month, to be shown at the Guildhall exhibition. the first time it will have left this house in living memory. Her voice caught, very slightly. I cannot think how I shall explain its loss to the museum trustees, Mr. Holmes, let alone to my late husband's memory. Before we left the drawing room, Holmes asked one further, small favour, that the cup from which Mrs. Wexford had taken her chocolate the night before, not yet washed by the household staff in the confusion of the morning, be brought to him for examination. Constance returned with it a few minutes later, and Holmes, drawing from his travelling case the small folding kit of reagents he so rarely journeyed without, tested what little residue remained in the bottom of the cup with the careful, unhurried attention of a chemist rather than a detective. "There," he said at last, holding the treated paper up to the window light, where it had taken on a faint, telltale discoloration. A mild preparation of chloral, I should judge, of the kind any household medicine chest might reasonably contain for the treatment of a restless night, enough to ensure a sound and dreamless sleep for some 10 or 11 hours, but nothing whatsoever that need alarm you as to your long-term health, Mrs. Wexford. You were not unwell last night. You were, quite simply and quite deliberately, put soundly to sleep by someone in this house who knew precisely how much to give you and precisely why. Mrs. Wexford's hand had gone to her throat. Someone in this house drugged me, Mr. Holmes. I am afraid so, madam, though I do not believe, from the mildness of the dose and the evident care taken not to harm you, that whoever did it wished you any lasting ill. I think rather that they wished only to be entirely certain you would not wake. Holmes set the little vial and its stained paper carefully aside. Which tells us a very great deal, Mrs. Wexford, about the character of the person we are seeking. A thief indifferent to your welfare would have used a heavier hand, or no drug at all, trusting instead to luck and quietness. This was the work of someone who loves you, or who at the very least could not bring themselves to risk your health for the sake of what they had come to take. You need explain nothing to anyone just yet, madam, said Holmes, rising. Let us first see the room. I noted, as we made to leave, that Mr. Renwick had gone very quiet during this last exchange, his eyes fixed upon the fire rather than upon any of us, and that his hands, folded in his lap, were gripping one another with a tightness that seemed to me, even then, rather more than the occasion of a friend's misfortune alone would naturally explain. Holmes, I felt certain, from the brief, sidelong glance he gave the old jeweller as we passed, had noticed it too. Before we quitted the drawing room, Holmes paused a moment longer, addressing the household generally in the mild, unhurried tone he so often used to gather small facts that his listeners did not always realize until well afterward they had given away. One further question, if I may, before we proceed. Was anyone outside this household present at Thistlewood Grange in the days immediately preceding last night? A tradesman, a visiting friend, anyone at all unfamiliar with the house's usual comings and goings? It was Constance who answered. There was a gentleman down from London on Tuesday last, a Mr. Aldercroft, a dealer of some kind, I understood, though I did not much care for his manner. He wrote asking to view the star, saying he represented a private collector interested in purchasing a comparable stone should one ever come to market, and my aunt, out of courtesy to Sir Aubrey's old connections in the trade, permitted him a brief viewing. He stayed scarcely an hour, and I confess I was glad to see the back of him. Did he express any particular interest in the room itself, its security, its construction? Now that you mention it, Mr. Holmes, he did ask a good many questions I thought rather impertinent at the time, whether the case was ever left unlocked, whether the household kept a night watchman, that sort of thing. I set it down to a dealer's professional caution regarding a stone he hoped one day to handle honestly. I confess it strikes me rather differently now. Holmes's eyes had sharpened with interest. I should like his direction in London, if it was left with you, though I do not think, Miss Wexford, that we need trouble ourselves overmuch with Mr. Aldercroft just yet. A stranger asking careless questions on a single afternoon visit is one thing. The theft we are examining required knowledge a single hour's viewing could scarcely have supplied. But it is a thread worth holding loosely in mind, and I thank you for it. As we made our way toward the study, Constance fell into step beside me, a little apart from Holmes, who had gone ahead to begin his examination of the door. "You must think this a very strange household, Dr. Watson," she said, with a small, tired attempt at a smile. "A theft, a locked room, an aunt who cannot remember her own evening, a cousin who cannot look anyone in the eye. I have seen a good many strange households in my years with Mr. Holmes," I said, "and I have generally found the strangest ones to be, underneath it all, simply the ones carrying the most love and the most fear of losing it. You seem very devoted to your aunt." Something in her face softened at that. "She took me in when I had no one else in the world, Dr. Watson. My own parents died when I was 9, a fever, the same summer, within a fortnight of one another, and I remember very little of that time except that Aunt Iris came for me herself, rather than sending some solicitor to manage the arrangements, and held my hand the whole train journey down from London, and told me, somewhere along the way, that a house was only a house, but that I was, from that day forward, to consider myself entirely and permanently her own." Her eyes had grown bright. "I would do a great deal to spare her further grief, Dr. Watson. I confess that is rather why I sent for you so urgently. I could not bear to see her frightened and bewildered, one moment longer than I had to, not after everything she has already given me." "Then I think," I said, "that Mr. Holmes and I have come to the right house, for we shall not rest easily, either, until she has her answer." She pressed my hand, briefly, in thanks, and we went in together to where Holmes already stood before the study door, his lens already in hand. The study lay at the end of a short passage on the ground floor, in the older wing of the house, and I understood at once, upon seeing it, exactly why the family's account of the room's security had impressed Constance Wexford so thoroughly. The door was a heavy, old piece of oak, fitted with a modern lock, and below it, an iron bolt of considerable weight, evidently added at some later date, its housing sunk deep and solid into the frame. Holmes examined both with his lens before we had gone 3 steps into the room, and pronounced them, after some minutes, entirely undamaged. "The lock has not been picked," he said. "There is not a mark upon it that a picking tool would leave. And the bolt, observe, Watson, how deeply it is set, and how thick the metal. This was not forced. It was drawn across from the inside by a hand in this room, and has not been touched since." The room itself was a study of the old-fashioned kind, lined with dark bookshelves on 3 sides, a heavy desk before the single window, and, set into an alcove between 2 bookcases, a glass display case, its lid now standing open and empty, in which, Constance explained, her voice unsteady, the Wexford star had rested, displayed upon a small velvet cushion, every night for as long as she could remember. The window itself, tall and narrow, was fitted with iron bars set deep into the stone on either side. Unbroken, unbent, exactly as old and undisturbed, Holmes noted after careful examination, as the ancient, unbroken lattice of cobweb that stretched, delicate and entirely intact, across the lower corner of the glass, just within the bars. "That cobweb, Watson," said Holmes quietly, "is perhaps the single most eloquent witness in this entire room. No hand, however skilled, opens that window and passes anything at all through those bars without disturbing a web so fine and so precisely placed. Whoever took the star did not come by the window." "Nor by the door," I said, "if the bolt was truly drawn as your examination suggests." "Nor by the door," Holmes agreed. He spent some further minutes upon the chimney breast that dominated the room's 4th wall, kneeling at the cold hearth with his lamp held close, running his hand up into the flue itself as far as his arm would reach, and pronouncing at last, with a faint grimace at the state of his own sleeve, that the opening narrowed sharply some 2 feet above the fireplace to a width that would not have admitted a determined cat, let alone a grown man or even a child of any size, and shows, besides, no disturbance whatsoever in the soot that has gathered undisturbed along its inner ledge for what I should judge to be a very great many years. He turned next to the heavy desk beneath the window, drawing out each drawer in turn, and examining its contents with the swift, thorough attention of a man cataloguing rather than searching. Old correspondence, household ledgers, a box of visiting cards, nothing that appeared, to my own eye at least, to bear any relation to the matter at hand. "You examine the desk with some care," I observed, "for a room whose thief plainly came for the case alone." "I examine everything with some care, Watson, precisely because I do not yet know which details will prove to matter and which will not," said Holmes, without looking up. "It is a common error in this profession to decide too early what is relevant and what is not, and thereafter to see only what one has already decided to look for. I had rather waste 10 minutes upon an empty desk drawer than overlook, through impatience, the one detail that would have made this whole matter plain within the hour." He closed the last drawer and straightened and turned once more upon the spot to survey the room as a whole. The empty case, the barred window, the solid bolted door, the dark ranks of bookshelves rising to the ceiling on 3 sides, with the particular stillness of a man allowing a room to speak to him in its own time, rather than hurrying it toward a confession it was not yet ready to give. "Door and window both secure beyond reasonable doubt," he said at last, half to himself. "Chimney impassable, and yet the star is gone. And Mrs. Wexford sat within these 4 walls the entire night, and swears to having seen and heard nothing whatsoever." He turned slowly upon the spot, his eyes moving over every surface of the room with the unhurried, comprehensive attention I had seen him bring to 100 such puzzles before. "Which leaves us, my dear Watson, with only the most interesting possibility remaining to us, that this room, for all its appearance of perfect enclosure, is not quite so enclosed as its builders intended 2 centuries and more ago." He crossed to the bookshelves lining the wall behind the empty display case, and began, with the careful, patient thoroughness of a man who expects to find something and merely wishes to be certain of exactly where, running his fingers along the edges of the shelving, tapping lightly here and there upon the paneling behind the books, listening, with his ear bent close to the old dark wood, for whatever answer the house itself might offer him. "Mrs. Wexford," he said at last without turning, "was this house, to your knowledge, ever used for any purpose that might have required a hidden passage? Smuggling, perhaps, in an earlier generation. This county has a long history of it along its southern coast, or the concealment of persons during some period of religious or political trouble." Mrs. Wexford, who had come to stand in the doorway with Constance and Bertram behind her, looked startled by the question. I believe there was some story, Mr. Holmes, of my husband's great-grandfather having sheltered a fugitive priest generations ago in the days when such things were dangerous. I had always thought it merely a family tale, the sort every old house seems to collect. "Tell me the tale properly, if you would," said Holmes, without turning from his examination of the shelving. "Old family stories, however fanciful they seem, are very often built upon a foundation a good deal more literal than the family itself has come to believe." Mrs. Wexford drew a steadying breath, and for a moment, standing there in the doorway with the late afternoon light falling grey and thin behind her, she seemed to set aside the fright of the morning and become, instead, simply a woman telling a story she had heard 100 times at her own husband's knee. "The tale, as it was always told to me, goes back to the first Sir Aubrey, my husband's grandfather's grandfather, the one who is said to have brought the star home from India in the last century, though I have always privately suspected that particular detail has grown a good deal grander with each generation's retelling. It was he who built this wing of the house, over an older foundation, and it was said, I never quite believed it, Mr. Holmes, until this very afternoon, that he built into it certain hidden ways, for reasons never fully explained to the family that came after him. Some said it was smuggling, this county having always had a lively trade along its coast in goods the Crown would rather not have seen landed. Others said it was religion, a family grown quietly sympathetic, in an unsympathetic age, to persons the law of the time considered dangerous simply for the manner in which they chose to pray. I confess I always assumed the whole story a piece of harmless romance, the sort every old family likes to tell about its own foundations, and never once imagined I might one day stand in this very room and watch a bookshelf swing open to prove it entirely, literally true. Legends, said Holmes, still working carefully at the shelving, are very often simply history that has not yet been properly excavated. I find that comforting in my line of work. It suggests that even the strangest tale generally has, somewhere beneath its fancy, a plain and traceable set of footprints, provided one is patient enough and stubborn enough to go looking for them. Family tales, in my experience, said Holmes, very often conceal a literal truth beneath their picturesque exterior. His fingers had found something now, a seam in the paneling, so finely made as to be nearly invisible even to a close inspection, running along the edge of the third shelf from the floor. He pressed and probed, and after a moment's careful searching, found some small catch or lever concealed behind the spine of an old leather-bound volume, and with a soft, protesting groan of hinges, long unused, a section of the bookshelf, books and all, fixed cleverly to a hidden panel, swung inward upon itself, revealing a narrow black opening in the wall behind, and beyond it, the first few steps of a descending stone stair. There was a general gasp from the doorway. Mrs. Wexford's hand flew to her mouth. I have lived in this house 40 years, she whispered, and never once suspected. Most families do not, said Holmes, taking up the lamp Constance had thought to light, and holding it up to illuminate the dark passage beyond. A well-built hidden way is meant, after all, to remain hidden. And this one, I think, has been very well built indeed, and very carefully maintained by someone with reason enough to keep its hinges oiled and its passage clear. He glanced back at us, his eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just watched the first and most stubborn piece of a puzzle click cleanly into place. I believe, Watson, that we have found our locked room's one true door. Now we must discover who, in this household, already knew of its existence. Before we descended into the passage itself, Holmes asked that the household's butler, a grave, silver-templed man named Sedgwick, who had plainly served the family a great many years, be brought to us in the study, and it was here, I think, that a promising line of inquiry very nearly led us in an entirely wrong direction, before Holmes's patience with small and unglamorous facts set it right again. You have charge of the household keys, Mr. Sedgwick, Holmes asked. I have, sir. Every key in this house passes through my hands at one time or another, save the small key to the display case itself, which Mrs. Wexford has always kept upon her own person. And were you aware, before this morning, of the existence of a passage behind that bookshelf? The butler's composed face registered for the first time a flicker of genuine surprise. A passage, sir? I was not, and I confess, I find it difficult to credit even now, having served in this house 31 years. Holmes studied him a long moment. The steady eyes, the unhesitating answer, the plain shock that showed itself, I thought, rather too immediately and rather too completely to have been rehearsed by a guilty man. I believe you, he said at last. Though I must ask you one further thing, Mr. Sedgwick, and I should be grateful for an honest answer, however awkward it may prove. Has any member of this household's staff given you cause, in recent weeks, to doubt their loyalty, A servant recently dismissed, perhaps, or one nursing some particular grievance. Sedgwick hesitated, and I saw Holmes mark the hesitation at once. There was a footman, sir, let go at Michaelmas for persistent lateness, and worse besides. Drink, if I am honest, sir, though Mrs. Wexford was gentler in the matter than many mistresses would have been. He left with hard words for the household, I understand, though I could not tell you where he has gone since, nor whether he harboured any grudge sufficient to explain a thing so elaborate as this. His name, Tobias Fenn, sir. Holmes turned this name over for some minutes, and I confess that for the better part of an hour that followed, our inquiry ran hard along the trail of the dismissed footman. His lodgings in the village traced and found empty, his character inquired after among the household staff who remained, his possible grievance against a family that had, by every account, treated him with more patience than his own conduct had strictly earned. It was, I thought at the time, a thoroughly reasonable line to pursue, and I said as much to Holmes as we walked back toward the study. It is entirely reasonable, Watson, which is precisely why I distrust it, Holmes said, rather to my surprise. A dismissed servant with a grudge is the most obvious suspect this household could possibly offer us, and the most obvious suspect is very often not the correct one, particularly in a case constructed with the care and precision this one plainly required. Fenn, whatever his faults, was dismissed in the ordinary way, through the front door, in full view of the household. He can have had no occasion, in his final weeks here, to go creeping about behind bookshelves, searching for hidden passages no one else in this house has discovered in 2 centuries. No, Watson. I think our footman is a thread worth noting, and no more than that. The true answer to this puzzle, I strongly suspect, lies with someone who has had a great deal longer than a few resentful weeks to come to know this house's every secret corner. He paused at the study door, his hand upon the frame. Someone, in fact, who has had the whole of a lifetime. It was with that thought turning in his mind, I believe, that Holmes returned his full attention to the bookshelf itself, and it was scarcely 20 minutes later that his patient searching found the hidden catch that had, all along, been waiting quietly behind the spine of an old leather volume for a hand that finally knew to look for it. The passage, when Holmes and I descended it, leaving the household above, at Holmes's request, so that our examination might proceed undisturbed, proved to run some 15 feet along a narrow stone stair before opening into a small chamber, little more than a priest's hiding hole in truth, its low ceiling forcing even a man of ordinary height to stoop, its walls furred everywhere with the fine grey dust of long disuse, save, Holmes noted at once, holding his lamp close, along a narrow track worn smooth and comparatively clean down the centre of the floor, as though feet had passed that way, quietly and repeatedly, over a span of time considerably longer than a single desperate night could account for. "Someone has used this passage before, Watson," he murmured, crouching to examine the worn stone more closely. "Not once, in a single fit of midnight desperation, but many times, over what I should judge to be a period of years rather than weeks. That is a fact I did not expect to find, and I confess it complicates rather than simplifies the picture I had begun to form. From the little chamber, a second, lower passage led onward, so low, in places, that we were obliged to go forward almost entirely upon our hands and knees, our lamp throwing long, uncertain shadows across walls that had not, I should think, felt the touch of daylight in a very great many years. The air down there carried a particular cold, damp mustiness, quite unlike the ordinary chill of the cellars above. The smell, I thought, of stone that had never once been permitted to breathe freely, sealed away behind its hidden panel for 2 centuries at a stretch, disturbed only by whatever quiet, purposeful footsteps had lately taken to using it. Twice I struck my head against some low outcropping of the old stonework, and once Holmes paused so long, examining some fresh mark upon the wall by lamplight, that I very nearly lost my patience with the whole undignified business entirely, though I confess, watching his face in that yellow light, absorbed and delighted, despite the discomfort of our position, that my irritation never quite got the better of my own curiosity as to what he had found. At last, the passage began to slope gently upward once more, and the air, by degrees, grew a little less close, a little less ancient, until it emerged into what proved to be an old, disused pantry in the cellar, its outer door opening, in turn, upon a flight of steps leading up into the kitchen garden behind the house. A most convenient route, Holmes observed, straightening and brushing the dust of 2 centuries from his coat sleeves, for anyone with knowledge of it, wishing to enter or leave the study, without troubling the household's more visible doors and windows. He knelt at the base of the outer pantry door, and I saw his attention sharpen upon something at the threshold. And here, Watson, is our first tangible trace of the passage's most recent traveller. Upon the stone step, faint but unmistakable in the grey afternoon light, was a small dark smear. Soot, Holmes pronounced after a moment's examination with his lens, of the particular fine, oily quality that accumulates upon old stonework left long undisturbed in an unventilated space. Whoever came this way brushed against the passage wall closely enough to carry away a measure of its dust upon their clothing, Holmes said, and has left a trace of it here, at the threshold, where they paused, I should think, to gather themselves before stepping out into the open garden. He rose, dusting his hands. It is not much, Watson, but it is a beginning. Whoever we are looking for has, somewhere in their wardrobe at this very moment, a garment marked with the particular dark soot of that old passage, and I do not think it will prove impossible to find it. We sat a while upon the cold stone steps outside the pantry door, in the thin grey light of that February afternoon, while Holmes turned the whole matter over aloud, in the manner he so often used with me, not, I had long since come to understand, because he required my assistance in the reasoning itself, but because the act of speaking a theory aloud to another mind seemed to sharpen and test it in ways his own silent thought did not. Let us consider who might have known of this passage, he said. Not the household staff, I think. Sedgwick's shock at the discovery struck me as entirely genuine, and a man who has kept every key in this house for 31 years is not, in my experience, a man who conceals a secret of this magnitude from mere discretion alone. Not, I think, the dismissed footman Fenn, for reasons I have already given you. That narrows our field considerably, Watson, to those with a lifetime's familiarity with this house's every forgotten corner. The family itself, then. The family itself. Mrs. Wexford we may set aside at once. She was drugged, or I am very much mistaken, and a woman does not drug herself merely to construct an elaborate alibi for a theft she has arranged against her own dearest possession. That leaves us, Watson, with a rather smaller circle than we began with this morning, a nephew with the anxious, ill-concealed manner of a man carrying some private trouble far heavier than the day's general distress alone would explain, and an old family friend, whose hands, I noticed, would not keep still throughout the whole of our conversation in that drawing-room, and whose eyes went everywhere in that room except toward the empty case itself. He rose, brushing the last of the passage's dust from his coat. It is a curious thing, Watson, how rarely a truly guilty man can bring himself to look directly at the scene of his own guilt, and how often an innocent one, burdened only by some entirely separate secret, makes precisely the same error out of an entirely different and unrelated shame. I confess I am not yet certain which of our 2 candidates we are dealing with, or whether, indeed, we are dealing with both at once, each pursuing some separate and quite unconnected purpose beneath the very same roof. 2 mysteries under one roof, I said. It would not be the first time. It would not, Holmes agreed, and I begin to suspect, Watson, that it is rather more often the case than the tidier sort of story generally allows. Real households, unlike the story papers, rarely trouble themselves to arrange their secrets one at a time for a detective's convenience. He glanced back toward the house, its grey gables just visible above the bare kitchen garden hedge. "Come, I think it is time we examined a certain gentleman's coat sleeve rather more directly than good manners would ordinarily permit." We returned to the house by the ordinary route, through the kitchen garden and in by a side door, and it was as we crossed the hall toward the drawing-room once more that we very nearly collided with Bertram Wexford, hurrying in the opposite direction with the particular haste of a man anxious not to be observed, a small travelling bag in one hand. "Mr. Wexford," Holmes's voice, mild as ever, nonetheless, stopped the man in his tracks, as effectively as a hand upon his collar. "You are leaving us rather suddenly." Yes, business in London, urgent business. I had quite forgotten, in all the upset of the morning, that I was engaged to— Bertram's explanation trailed away beneath Holmes's steady, unhurried gaze, and I saw the man's damp hands tighten upon the handle of his bag. "That is to say, Mr. Holmes, I do not see that my presence here serves any further purpose. I have told you all I know of the matter." "You have told me remarkably little, in fact," said Holmes, "beyond your opinion that the Star ought to have been kept in a bank vault. But, since you are so anxious to be gone, Mr. Wexford, perhaps you would indulge me in one small matter before you go, the coat you are presently wearing. I wonder if I might examine the left sleeve." I watched the colour drain, quite visibly, from Bertram Wexford's heavy face. I don't see what business my coat sleeve is of yours, sir." "None whatsoever," Holmes agreed pleasantly, "unless, of course, it should happen to bear a mark of fine dark soot along the forearm, of a particular oily quality one finds only in disused stone passages left unswept for the better part of a century, in which case, Mr. Wexford, I rather think it becomes a very great deal of my business indeed, and I suspect, upon reflection, that you would very much prefer to discuss the matter with me quietly now, rather than with the local constabulary, rather more publicly an hour from now." For a long moment, Bertram Wexford stood entirely still in the dim hall, his bag still clutched in one hand, his face working through what I can only describe as a rapid and visible collapse of resolve. "You cannot know that," he said, though his voice had already lost most of its earlier bluster. "You have not even looked at my coat." "I have looked at very little else since you came hurrying so anxiously down that staircase, Mr. Wexford," said Holmes. "You have kept your left arm held rather stiffly away from your side this last quarter hour, the way a man does when he is uncomfortably aware of a mark upon his sleeve and wishes it noticed by no one. You have also, if I am not mistaken, changed your coat once already this morning. I observed a grey one upon you at breakfast, from the window of the trap as we arrived, and you wear a brown one now, in the middle of the day, which is a curious economy for a gentleman ordinarily so careful of his appearance. I do not think you changed it for comfort, Mr. Wexford. I think you changed it because the grey one would not survive a close examination, and you have, at this very moment, that same grey coat, folded at the bottom of the bag you are so eager to carry away from this house." And then, all at once, his shoulders sagged, and the bag slipped from his fingers to the floor, and he sank onto the small hall bench with the boneless suddenness of a man whose last reserve of nerve has simply given out beneath him. "I did not mean any harm to my aunt," he said, in a voice gone hoarse and low. "You must believe that, Mr. Holmes, whatever else you come to believe of me." We took him into the small morning room, away from the rest of the household, and it was there, over the better part of an hour, that Bertram Wexford's confession emerged, halting, shamefaced, but, I believed even as I listened to it, entirely genuine in its remorse. He had, he admitted, fallen deeply into debt, gambling debts, incurred over several years and concealed, with increasing desperation, from every member of his family, debts that had recently come due at the hands of a bookmaker, whose patience, he said, had grown considerably shorter than his manners ever were, and whose most recent letter had contained threats sufficiently alarming that Bertram had, in the darkest hour of a sleepless week, begun to contemplate a solution he would never, he insisted, otherwise have considered. At Holmes's quiet request, he produced the letter itself from an inner pocket, a single crumpled sheet, much folded and refolded, as though read and reread a great many anxious times, its message brief and ugly in its plainness. A sum named, a date given, and beneath both, in a hand grown careless with menace, a line promising that gentlemen of quality generally find some way to settle what is owed, one way or another, and Mr. Wexford would be wise to remember that his aunt's fine house has a great many valuable trinkets in it, should ready coin prove difficult to find by more conventional means. Holmes read it through twice, his mouth tightening. "This is not merely a debt collector's ordinary impatience, Mr. Wexford," he said. "This is very close to an extortion, and a rather ugly one at that. A man suggesting, in terms just barely short of the actionable, that you might do well to steal from your own family to satisfy him. I think, when this matter is settled, you would do well to place this letter in the hands of your family's solicitor rather than burn it, as I suspect you have been tempted to do 100 times already. A man who writes threats of this kind rarely stops of his own accord, and your aunt, I think, would rather see him dealt with properly than see her nephew driven to further desperate measures by his continued pressure." Bertram's hands, when he took the letter back, were shaking. "I have been so ashamed of it, Mr. Holmes, that I could not bring myself to show it to a living soul until this moment. I told myself, over and over, that I had brought this entirely upon myself through my own foolishness at the tables, and that I had therefore no right to ask anyone else to help me carry the weight of it." "Shame," said Holmes, not unkindly, "is a very poor adviser, Mr. Wexford. It counsels silence precisely when speech would serve you best, and it drives good men toward exactly the sort of desperate, solitary decisions that make a bad situation very much worse. I think you will find, when you finally bring yourself to speak plainly with your aunt, that she is considerably less interested in your past folly than in your future honesty." He had known of the hidden passage since boyhood, had discovered it, in fact, quite by accident, exploring the old house's forgotten corners during a childhood summer spent at Thistlewood, and had kept the secret ever since, more from a boy's natural love of secrets than from any darker purpose, until desperation had at last given that old secret a use he had never intended it for. On the night in question, he had slipped a small quantity of a mild sleeping draught. Nothing dangerous, Mr. Holmes, I swear it, only enough to ensure she slept soundly and did not wake, into his aunt's evening cocoa, using an excuse to fetch it to her himself. Once certain the household had retired and his aunt was soundly asleep in her chair, he had made his way down through the old passage, entered the study through the hidden panel, and taken the sapphire from its case, intending to have it cut and sold in small pieces through a contact in London, far from any eye that might recognize so famous a stone hole. "And then," he said, his voice dropping further still, "then, Mr. Holmes, I did the one thing in this whole sorry business I am not ashamed of. I looked at it properly, alone in that passage by the light of my own lamp, before ever I left the house, and I knew, the moment I held it, that something was wrong. Wrong how?" Holmes asked, very quietly, though I saw in his face that he had, I think, already half guessed the answer. "It is glass, Mr. Holmes," Bertram said, "or paste, or some manner of clever imitation. I do not know enough of gemstones to say precisely what, but I know enough, from handling my aunt's other jewels over the years, to know a true stone's particular weight and cold when I feel it, and this had neither. It is a fake, Mr. Holmes. The Wexford star that has sat in that case my whole life, that my grandfather's grandfather is said to have brought home from India, it is not real, and has not been real, I think, for a very long time." "And what did you do upon making that discovery?" Holmes asked. "I very nearly wept, Mr. Holmes, crouched there in that filthy passage, with a lamp guttering low, and a piece of coloured glass in my hand, where I had expected a fortune sufficient to save me. And then I very nearly laughed, God forgive me, at the black absurdity of it, that I should have risked everything, my own name, my aunt's trust, whatever remained of my own conscience, to steal a thing that was never worth stealing at all. He passed a hand across his face. I sat there the better part of an hour, Mr. Holmes, turning it over and over, trying to decide what on earth I ought to do. I could not simply return it to the case, for then my aunt would wake to find it moved, and know at once that someone had disturbed the room in the night. I could not leave it lying in the passage, for it would surely be found. In the end, I took it away with me, meaning only to think the matter through properly once I was calmer. And it was still in my pocket this morning when I heard you and Dr. Watson had been sent for, and I confess my nerve very nearly failed me altogether. You mentioned my aunt's other jewels, I said, for it had struck me, hearing him speak of judging a stone's true weight by long familiarity, that this was a curious skill for an ordinary nephew to possess. How does a country gentleman come to know a genuine stone's cold and weight so precisely? Bertram's colour rose. I have, that is, in the worst of my difficulties this past year, I confess, I made rather too free with several small pieces from my aunt's own jewel case, borrowing against them quietly with a pawnbroker in Winchester, always meaning to redeem them before she noticed their absence, and always, somehow, managing to do so just in time. He would not meet either of our eyes as he said it. It is not a history I am proud of, Mr. Holmes. I see now that it was, in its own smaller way, merely a rehearsal for the far greater and far worse theft I very nearly committed last night. There was a silence in that small morning room that I shall not easily forget. Bertram Wexford, sitting hunched and ashamed upon the sofa, the false sapphire itself, produced now from an inner pocket of his coat, lying upon the low table between us, catching the grey afternoon light with a cold, hard brilliance that gave no hint, to my own untrained eye, of anything false about it at all. Holmes took it up, turned it slowly in his long fingers, held it to the window light, and at last set it down again with the small, satisfied nod of a man whose theory has just received its final and most welcome confirmation. A very fine imitation, he said. Fine enough to have deceived a household, and very possibly a museum's own trustees, for who knows how many years. But an imitation nonetheless, Watson, and I believe I begin to understand a great deal more of this affair than I did an hour ago. He turned to Bertram. You will remain in this room, Mr. Wexford, and you will speak to no one until I give you leave. I do not think, given what you have just told me, that the local constabulary need be troubled with quite so severe a charge as you perhaps fear. But that will depend a very great deal upon what I learn in the next quarter of an hour, and I should advise you, in the meantime, to sit quietly and reflect upon exactly how close a call you have had, in more ways than one. We left Bertram in the morning room to reflect, as instructed, and paused a moment together in the passage outside, where Holmes stood turning the false sapphire slowly in the grey light from a nearby window, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. You do not seem entirely satisfied, Holmes, I observed, for a man who has just solved the whole of an impossible theft in under a day. I have solved the theft, Watson, but I do not think I have yet solved the mystery, he said. A young man's desperate borrowing against family jewels, redeemed always just in time, does not by itself explain how a stone worth a fortune came, 25 years ago, to be quietly replaced with a very fine piece of glass, made by a hand skilled enough that not one member of this household has noticed the substitution in all the years since. Bertram is no jeweller, Watson. Whatever else he is guilty of, he did not make that stone sitting in my hand, nor could he have arranged its making without help from someone who possessed both the necessary skill and a reason of their own to keep such a substitution secret for so very long. I think, Watson, that our old jeweller has a good deal more to tell us than he has yet found the courage to say, and I think it kinder, on the whole, to give him the chance to say it in private, before this family's whole gathered weight of shock and grief comes down upon him all at once. We found Mr. Josiah Renwick alone in the drawing-room, seated near the fire with a book open, unread, upon his knee, and I saw, the moment Holmes crossed the threshold, the old jeweller's hands go very still upon its pages. "Mr. Renwick," Holmes said, settling into the chair opposite without waiting to be asked, "I wonder if you would be good enough to examine something for me." He set the false sapphire down upon the small table between them. Renwick's eyes flicked to it, and away again, with a swiftness that told its own story before he had spoken a single word. "I am no longer needed to examine it, I think, Mr. Renwick," Holmes said, more gently than I had perhaps expected. "I believe you have known for a very long time exactly what that stone is, and exactly what it is not." The old man was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon the fire, and when at last he spoke, his voice had the flat, resigned quality of a man setting down a burden he has carried, alone, for far too many years. 25 years, Mr. Holmes," he said. 25 years I have known, and said nothing, because the man who asked my silence was my dearest friend in this world, and because the reason he gave me for asking it was one I could not, in good conscience, refuse. The story that followed, given quietly by an old man who plainly found some relief, at last, in the telling of it, carried us back 25 years, to a time when Sir Aubrey Wexford, Iris's late husband and Bertram's uncle, had faced a crisis of his own, a bad harvest compounded upon a worse investment, debts mounting upon the estate itself, and the very real prospect, Renwick said, of losing Thistlewood Grange entirely within the year. "You must understand what that house meant to him, Mr. Holmes," Renwick began, his voice low and unsteady. "Aubrey was not a vain man, nor an especially proud one in most matters. But Thistlewood had passed from father to son for 4 generations without a single break in the line, through wars and bad harvests and every other misfortune a century and a half can throw at a family, and he could not, simply could not, be the Wexford who let it slip away. When the second bad harvest came, on top of a foolish investment in an Argentine railway scheme that swallowed nearly everything his own father had left him, he came to me one evening looking 10 years older than the man I had dined with only a month before. He came to me in secret," Renwick went on, "begged me, as his oldest friend in the trade, to find a discreet buyer for the Star, a private sale, no auction, no publicity, nothing that might reach his wife's ears or the wider world's, for he could not bear, he told me, that Iris should ever know how close the family had come to ruin, nor that the stone her husband's family had treasured for 4 generations should be quietly sold away to save them. "She loves that stone more than she loves the house itself, Josiah," he told me, that very night, sitting in my own workshop with his head in his hands. "She married into this family for love, not for property, and that stone was the first thing I ever showed her, the very week we were engaged, and told her the whole foolish legend of it, and watched her eyes shine the way they had never shone at any of my father's talk of acreage and rent rolls. I cannot let her learn that I sold it out from under her to pay for my own bad judgment. I would rather she thought me merely careful with money than know the truth of how nearly I ruined us both. I did not think it right, Mr. Holmes, and I told him so plainly. But I had known Aubrey Wexford since we were boys together, and I had never in my life refused him anything he asked of me with that particular look in his eye, and I did not refuse him this. I found him a buyer, a private collector, abroad, who paid a fair price and asked no questions. And I had, myself, some skill in those days at the working of paste and glass, a hobby of my younger years, before I turned wholly to honest appraisal, and I made, for Sir Aubrey, the very stone that sits upon that table now, good enough to deceive any eye but the most expert, and certainly good enough to sit undisturbed in a family's display case for 25 years, admired and believed in by everyone who ever looked upon it. "Including Mrs. Wexford herself," said Holmes. "Including my dear Iris, yes," said Renwick, and his voice, upon her name, carried a warmth that told me a good deal about the true nature of a friendship 35 years old. "Aubrey never told her, Mr. Holmes. He could not bear to. He died 8 years ago, still keeping that secret, and made me swear upon his deathbed that I would keep it after him, for her sake, for he said she had loved that stone as a symbol of the family's whole long history, and he could not bear that she should learn, in her grief, that the history itself had been quietly sold away beneath her." He was quiet a moment, staring into the fire, and when he spoke again his voice had gone smaller still. "I have watched her, these 8 years since, sit beside that case every evening exactly as she did tonight, and speak of that stone to every visitor who admires it as though it were her own dear child, and I have said nothing, Mr. Holmes, nothing at all, and told myself each time that my silence was a kindness. I am no longer entirely certain it was. I think, perhaps, it was only the easier road, dressed up to look like loyalty." He passed a trembling hand across his eyes. "And now, this wretched insurance valuation, this museum exhibition. I have spent a fortnight in an agony you cannot imagine, Mr. Holmes, trying to think how I might examine that stone before the trustee's own expert did, and find some way to withdraw it from the exhibition quietly, without ever revealing why. I wrote 3 separate letters to the museum committee proposing reasons the family might reconsider, and tore up every one of them as inadequate. I lay awake 3 nights running trying to invent some illness, some excuse, anything that would keep that stone from ever leaving this house under an expert eye more searching than my own. I confess, when I heard this morning that it had been stolen outright, my very first feeling, God forgive me for it, was something perilously close to relief, and my very next feeling, hard upon the heels of it, was a shame so complete that I have scarcely been able to look Iris in the face all morning. It fell to Holmes, that evening, to gather the whole household together in the drawing-room and lay the entire matter before them, a task he undertook, I thought, with an unusual gentleness, mindful as he was of just how much old grief and old secrecy the day's discoveries had brought, all at once, into the light. He began, as he so often did in such moments, not with the answer itself, but with the shape of the puzzle as it had first appeared to him, the bolted door, the barred window, the unbroken web across the glass, walking the assembled family back through each step of his reasoning with the patient, unhurried clarity of a man who understood that the telling of a solution is very nearly as important to those who have lived through the mystery as the solution itself. "When I first entered that study," he said, "I confess, I found it one of the most perfectly sealed rooms I have ever had occasion to examine. A lesser investigator, faced with a door bolted from within and a window undisturbed even at its cobwebs, might have been tempted toward explanations considerably less rational than the one I ultimately arrived at. But I have long held, Mrs. Wexford, that an impossible room is very rarely impossible in fact. It is only a room whose true entrance has not yet been found, and a house, as old as this one, I reasoned, was exceedingly unlikely to have kept every one of its secrets for 2 centuries without losing track of at least one." He described, then, the discovery of the passage, the worn track along its stone floor that spoke of long and repeated use, and the small trace of soot that had, in the end, led him first toward Bertram's coat sleeve, and, by a rather more painful and roundabout route, toward the truth beneath the truth, the paste stone, and the 25-year-old kindness that had put it there. "I want to be entirely plain with you all," Holmes said, when he had finished the account, "that in my judgment, no malice lies at the heart of this matter, only a great deal of frightened, tangled love, expressed by two different men in two very different and equally mistaken ways. I do not think either of them deserves to carry the weight of today's discoveries alone into the future. I think, rather, that this family has been given a rare and rather precious opportunity most households never receive, the chance to set down every secret it has been quietly carrying, all at once, and to decide together, in full possession of the truth, exactly what sort of family it wishes to be from this evening onward. Mrs. Wexford listened to the full account, her nephew's desperate theft, the old passage he had used, the sleeping draught, and beneath it all, older and deeper than either, her own late husband's 25-year-old secret, with a stillness that gave way, by degrees, first to shock, then to a kind of wondering grief, and at last, to my very great relief, to something that looked almost like release. "He never told me," she said softly, when Holmes had finished. "All those years, Mr. Holmes, I sat beside that case each evening and thought of Aubrey's grandfather, bringing that stone home from India, and I never once knew I was admiring a piece of glass Josiah made with his own two clever hands to spare my feelings." She looked, for a long moment, toward Renwick, who sat with his head bowed, unable to meet her eyes. "I ought to be angry with you both, I suppose. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am not. I find only that I am glad, after all these years, to finally understand." Her gaze moved, gentler still, toward Bertram, sitting white-faced and wretched near the door. "And you, my dear boy, you very nearly broke my heart twice over in a single night. Once, by taking what you believed to be our family's whole treasure, and once, by very nearly leaving this house forever, rather than trust any of us enough to simply ask for help." "I was ashamed, Aunt Iris," Bertram said, very low. "I could not bear for you to know how badly I had failed. We are none of us, in this room, quite so free of failure as we like to pretend," said Mrs. Wexford. And there was, in her tired, gentle voice, a forgiveness that moved me more than I had expected such a quiet moment to do. "Debts can be paid, Bertram, in time, and with honest work, and I find I would very much rather help you pay them than see you carry them alone into worse trouble still. But you will never again take anything from this house without asking, do you understand me? Not while you have an aunt still living who loves you enough to give it freely, if only you would let her." She rose then, with Constance's steadying hand at her elbow, and crossed to a small writing desk in the corner of the drawing-room, from which she drew a slim packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. Letters, she explained, that Sir Aubrey had written her during their long courtship, kept these many years in a drawer she rarely opened, for the pain of reading them too often. "I want to read you something, Josiah," she said, and her voice, though still tired, had steadied into something firmer than before. She untied the ribbon with careful fingers and drew out a single sheet, yellowed now with age, and read aloud, in a voice that trembled only slightly, "I have shown you the star today, my dearest Iris, and I confess I showed it to you as much for the pleasure of watching your face as for any pride I take in the stone itself. Stones are only stones in the end. It is the people who love them and love each other around them that give them any worth at all." She lowered the letter, her eyes bright. He knew that, even then, 30 years before he ever had cause to prove it. "I do not think, Josiah, that he would want either of us grieving over a piece of glass tonight, when the thing he actually meant to protect, this family, and my own foolish, undeserved happiness, was never in any danger at all." Renwick, listening, had put a hand briefly over his eyes, and when he lowered it, I saw that his composure, so carefully kept through the whole long recitation of his confession, had finally, quietly, given way. "You are far kinder than I have any right to expect, Iris," he said. "I have been afraid of this conversation for 8 years. Then you have wasted 8 years being afraid of me, Josiah Renwick. which I think a very poor use of an old friend's time," she said, not unkindly, and reached out to take his hand in both of her own. "Come, let us have no more secrets kept out of kindness in this house. I find they cost a great deal more, in the end, than the truth ever would have." There remained, of course, the practical matters that any such evening must eventually settle into. Holmes spoke privately with Mrs. Wexford before supper that night, and I was present for a portion of that conversation in which he counselled, gently, but with the particular firmness he reserved for matters he considered genuinely important, that no charge need be brought against Bertram, given the stone's true nature and the family's own evident wish to keep the whole old secret from ever reaching beyond these walls, provided the young man made proper and lasting arrangements to settle his debts and mend his ways under his aunt's own watchful, forgiving eye. "He will not find it easy," Holmes said, "to be forgiven so completely and so quickly. Shame of the kind he carries does not lift merely because the household has decided to be merciful. You would do well, Mrs. Wexford, to give him some honest work to occupy his hands and his conscience alike. The estate accounts, perhaps, under Sedgwick's supervision, or some similar charge that lets him prove himself useful rather than merely forgiven." "I had already thought as much myself, Mr. Holmes," said Mrs. Wexford, with the ghost of a smile. "I find that misfortune, however painful in the living of it, has a way of teaching a family rather more about itself in a single day than a decade of ordinary comfortable years ever could." That evening, the whole household dined together for the first time since our arrival, a quieter meal than the grandeur of the dining room's long polished table and its ranks of family silver might have suggested, for every person seated at it carried, still, the particular weariness of a day that had asked a great deal of them, but a meal marked, too, by a warmth I had not felt in that house before, as though some old, cold draught that had long crept through its rooms had, at last, been shut firmly out. Bertram, seated near his aunt, spoke little, but ate with the appetite of a man whose appetite had only just been restored to him along with his conscience. Constance, across the table, watched her cousin with an expression that had softened, over the course of the day, from cool suspicion into something gentler, and once, when Bertram fumbled an apology for some small clumsiness with the wine, I saw her reach over and steady his hand with her own, briefly, before either of them seemed to notice she had done it. Renwick sat beside Mrs. Wexford, and the two of them talked, quietly, of old times, of Sir Aubrey, and of journeys taken decades before, and of the particular stubborn cheerfulness with which the man himself had always insisted, even in his worst years, that a family's true fortune could never be counted in stones or acres. It was, I thought, watching them, a very fine thing to see two old friends set down at last a burden that had stood silently between them for the best part of a decade. Holmes ate little, as was so often his habit when a case had lately occupied his full attention, but I noticed him watching the table with an expression I had rarely seen him wear at the close of an investigation. Not the restless, already departing look of a man whose mind has moved on to the next puzzle, but something quieter and more contented, the look, I thought, of a man taking a genuine private pleasure in the sight of a family mending itself before his eyes. "You are unusually quiet this evening, Holmes," I said, as the last course was cleared, and the family fell into easy, low conversation among themselves. "I am listening, Watson," he said. "There is a particular sound a household makes when it has stopped being afraid of itself, and I confess I do not hear it nearly often enough in the ordinary course of my work to take it for granted when I do." A similarly quiet understanding was reached some weeks later, for Holmes and I had occasion to learn of it by letter, as we so often learned the final chapters of our cases, long after we ourselves had returned to the ordinary business of Baker Street, with the museum trustees, that the Wexford family had decided, upon reflection, to withdraw the star from its planned exhibition at the Guildhall and keep it, as it had always been kept, a private family treasure rather than a public spectacle, its true nature known now only to those within Thistlewood's own walls, and, I confess, to Holmes and myself. The mysterious Mr. Aldercroft, whose impertinent questions about the study's security had first drawn Holmes's attention that first afternoon, proved in the end to be exactly what he had claimed, a legitimate, if somewhat clumsy, dealer scouting on behalf of a genuine collector abroad, whose interest in the star had nothing whatever to do with the events of that night, and whose only crime, Holmes remarked dryly, was possessing a dealer's naturally acquisitive curiosity at precisely the wrong moment to escape a detective's suspicion. A brief and entirely civil exchange of letters closed that particular thread for good. Nor was the dismissed footman, Tobias Fenn, ever found to have had any part whatsoever in the night's events, a fact Holmes confirmed some days after our return to London through a brief inquiry made on the family's behalf, discovering the man settled quietly into new employment 2 counties distant, his old grievance against Thistlewood apparently long since faded into the ordinary business of getting on with a life that had, by every account, improved considerably since his departure. "It is a small kindness of this profession, Watson," Holmes remarked, when the inquiry's answer reached us, "that one occasionally has the satisfaction of clearing a man's name as thoroughly as one implicates another's, and I confess I take a particular pleasure in being able to write to Mrs. Wexford that her former footman, whatever his failings, was never her midnight thief." And Mr. Renwick's own halting, grateful thanks to Holmes, given quietly at the door as we took our leave the following morning, stayed with me longer, I think, than almost anything else in that curious case, the thanks of an old man who had carried, gladly if wearily, a friend's secret for 25 years, and who seemed, that morning, lighter upon his feet than I had yet seen him, as though some old weight, set down at last, had left him rather more room to breathe than he had realized he was missing. "I confess, Mr. Holmes," he said, "I have wondered, more than once these past years, whether I did right in keeping Aubrey's secret so long. I find, now that it is finally out, that I am glad of it, gladder than I expected to be. A secret carried alone for 25 years grows very heavy indeed, however lovingly it was first taken up." "Most secrets do," said Holmes, "which is, I have found, very much the moral underlying the greater number of my cases, whatever mystery happens to sit atop it. Good day to you, Mr. Renwick. I think this family is fortunate in the friend it has kept, however many years his silence weighed upon him." Holmes and I rode back to the station in a companionable quiet that afternoon, the Hampshire hedgerows sliding past pale gold in the low winter light, and I remember remarking, somewhere along that ride, upon what a curious case it had been in the end, a theft that had solved itself into an act of desperate love, and a locked room whose true mystery had turned out to lie not in how the thief got in, but in how long a truth had managed to stay so carefully, so devotedly, shut away. "That is very often the shape of these things, Watson," Holmes said, watching the fields go by. "We are called in to solve a crime, and find, when we have finished, that we have merely opened a door someone shut, for reasons of their own, a very long time ago. I do not think Mrs. Wexford will grieve very long for a stone that was never, in the end, quite what she believed it to be. I think, rather, she has been given back something a great deal more valuable than any sapphire, real or false, the plain, unhidden truth of how deeply and how carefully she was loved, by a husband who moved heaven and earth to spare her a moment's grief, and by an old friend who carried that same tenderness quietly forward for 25 years after him. He was quiet a while, watching the pale winter light move across the fields, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on the reflective, unhurried quality I had come, over our years together, to treasure most in him, the voice he used not for the solving of a case, but for the turning over of what a case had taught him, long after the puzzle itself was settled. "I have noticed, Watson, that almost every locked room I have ever been called upon to open conceals, in the end, not a monster, but a wound. A man does not build a secret passage, nor tell a 25-year lie, nor drug his own beloved aunt with the gentlest hand he can manage, out of any great wickedness. He does it, very often, out of a love grown so tangled, and so afraid of its own consequences that it can no longer find a straighter way to express itself." Bertram did not wish to hurt his aunt. He wished, rather desperately, not to disappoint her, and could find no honest way to say so until the dishonest way had very nearly ruined him. Renwick did not wish to deceive his oldest friend's widow. He wished only to spare her a grief her husband himself had once begged him to spare her, and found, in the end, that a kindness kept too long simply becomes its own quiet, private suffering. He glanced at me. "I sometimes think, Watson, that half my profession consists of nothing more than persuading frightened people that the truth, however painful in the telling, is very rarely so unbearable as the years of guarding it against had led them to fear." "And the other half?" "The other half," he said, with the faint, dry smile I knew so well, "consists of climbing through a great many dusty passages, on my hands and knees, and ruining a perfectly good coat sleeve in the process, which I confess I mind rather more in the moment than any amount of philosophy afterward quite manages to console me for. And Bertram will, I think, make rather a better man of himself now than he would ever have managed while still carrying his shame alone in the dark," said Holmes. "Locked rooms, Watson, are curious things. We build them, most of us, not only around treasures we fear to lose, but around truths we fear to face. And I have generally found, in this profession, that the second kind of locked room causes a family a great deal more lasting harm than the first." We reached Baker Street as the lamps were coming up along the street, the fog settling soft and low, the way it so often did on winter evenings, and Mrs. Hudson met us on the stair with news of a hot supper waiting and a fire already built up warm against the cold. Holmes shrugged off his coat with the particular ease of a man glad to be home from a puzzle well and gently solved, and settled into his chair by the fire with the contented sigh of a man who has, for once, closed a case that left more warmth behind it than sorrow. "A good day's work, Watson," he said, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Not every mystery ends with a villain led away in handcuffs. Some end, rather more quietly, with an old secret finally allowed to rest, and a family a little closer to one another than they were the morning before. I find, on reflection, that I do not mind those endings nearly so little as I once believed I would." We received one further letter from Thistlewood Grange that spring, some months after our visit, and I think it fitting to close this account with a little of what it told us. Mrs. Wexford wrote in her own careful hand to say that Bertram had taken up the management of the estate accounts in earnest, under Sedgwick's patient eye, and had, in the space of a single winter, paid off the greater part of his old debts through nothing more glamorous than steady, honest work that had, she added, put more colour in his face and more ease in his manner than she had seen in him in years. Constance, she wrote with what I could easily imagine as a small private smile folded into the ink, had lately taken to walking with her cousin in the mornings before breakfast, and the two of them had grown, in her words, rather closer than two cousins raised half a household apart, generally trouble themselves to become, a sentence Holmes read aloud to me with considerable satisfaction, remarking that he had rather suspected as much from the manner in which Miss Wexford had steadied her cousin's wine-glass at that first quiet supper. And Josiah Renwick, she wrote, had taken to dining at Thistlewood twice a week now instead of once a month, and the two old friends had lately fallen into the pleasant habit of walking together in the kitchen garden of an afternoon, saying, I think, all the things we ought to have said to one another a great many years before either of us found the courage. The Wexford Star itself, the very same piece of clever glass that had caused so much quiet trouble, remained in its case in the study, exactly where it had always sat, admired now by the family with a fondness that had, if anything, only deepened for the knowledge of everything it had come, in the end, to represent. Not a fortune, nor an ancient legend, but a husband's love for his wife, and a friend's love for them both, and the long, patient work of a family learning, at last, to keep no more locked rooms between themselves than they truly needed. Holmes and I reached Baker Street as the lamps were coming up along the street, the fog settling soft and low, the way it so often did on winter evenings, and Mrs. Hudson met us on the stair, with news of a hot supper waiting and a fire already built up warm against the cold. Holmes shrugged off his coat with the particular ease of a man glad to be home from a puzzle well and gently solved, and settled into his chair by the fire with the contented sigh of a man who has, for once, closed a case that left more warmth behind it than sorrow. "A good day's work, Watson," he said, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Not every mystery ends with a villain led away in handcuffs. Some end, rather more quietly, with an old secret finally allowed to rest, and a family a little closer to one another than they were the morning before. I find, on reflection, that I do not mind those endings nearly so little as I once believed I would. And there, my friend, the story ends, as so many of the best ones do, not with a struggle, but with a door quietly opened and a room, long sealed, finally let breathe. If you are still with me, know that the fire beside you has burned down low now too, the coals glowing soft and orange the way they do at the very end of an evening, and there is nothing left to do but let the last of this story settle over you, warm and unhurried, the way it settled over Baker Street on that cold February night so long ago. Somewhere, that fog is still rolling gently along a quiet London street. Somewhere, an old sapphire, real or otherwise, rests undisturbed once more in its velvet case, guarding nothing now but a family's peace. Somewhere, two cousins are walking together in a bare winter garden that will, before very much longer, come green again. And somewhere, a very old and very carefully kept secret has, at last, been allowed to lay itself down and rest. Sleep well, my friend. The room is unlocked. There is nothing left, tonight, that needs guarding.